Room 203 wasn't gone. It had a new name. Susan Langley, stepmother of the groom. I didn't lose my spot. They handed it away with a smile. They didn't say I couldn't stay at the venue. They just handed my room to someone else, as if I'd never been part of the plan. No warning, no apology, just a front desk clerk blinking under fluorescent light, tapping keys like my presence was the inconvenience. I stood there in full makeup, hair pinned carefully to one side, holding the same suitcase I had packed 3 days early, thinking I was arriving as the mother of the groom, not some distant relative nobody remembered to include. "You've been moved to another room," she said, offering a polite, practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. There was a change in the arrangements. I asked her to check again. She rotated the monitor, and there it was, plain as daylight, room 203, now listed under the name Susan Langley, stepmother of the groom. I stared at the screen, hoping for a glitch, a typo, a miracle. But it was real. My name wasn't there, not on that screen, not on the welcome sign, not on any part of this carefully curated weekend. They hadn't removed me. They'd simply overwritten me, replaced. I nodded, swallowed the salt that climbed to my throat, and turned to walk back out through the same double doors I entered with so much hope, the sun now hitting my skin like it had changed temperature. The venue was beautiful. I had paid for part of it. I recognized the white drapes, the hydrangeas along the pathway, the curved arch Leo once pointed to in a magazine and said, "That's it, Mom, that's the one." And I had smiled, told him we'd make it happen. Now I wasn't even in the frame. I drove 6 miles to a highway motel with one working light bulb and the faint smell of mildew clinging to the air. I let myself in, set the suitcase down, and stood there for a long time, just breathing, afraid to sit, afraid that if I stopped moving, the heartbreak would settle too deep. I hung my dress on the hook above the mirror. It was soft blue, chosen to match the bridesmaid's palette. I picked it months ago. I hadn't bought a new dress in years. I thought this day was for both of us. But I was wrong. This day wasn't mine. My place had been given away silently, casually, permanently. No one told me to leave. They just made sure I wasn't seen. And when I finally sat on the edge of that motel bed, staring at the floral wallpaper curling away from the wall, I realized something colder than rejection. I wasn't an oversight. I was an afterthought they'd planned for. I wasn't asked to leave. I was just quietly placed where no one would ask where I was. Leo wasn't always like this. He used to crawl into bed beside me after nightmares, one hand gripping the hem of my nightgown like it was the only rope keeping him from drowning. "Don't let go, Mama," he'd whisper, and I never did. I was 26 when I brought him home, barely holding myself together, living in a one-room apartment above a second-hand bookstore that smelled like dust and old dreams. The floorboards creaked every time we walked across them, the ceiling fan rattled like it might fall, and the water heater had moods of its own, but we were happy. I washed uniforms at night, changed bedpans at dawn, sometimes skipped meals so he could have seconds. When he wanted a cake shaped like a rocket ship for his 7th birthday, I watched a dozen tutorial videos on a broken tablet and stayed up until 3 of them, baking with dollar store frosting and borrowed pans. His eyes lit up so brightly that morning, I forgot how much my back ached. He told his friends, "My mom made this all by herself. She's magic." And for a while, he believed that. So did I. We built a world out of shared meals and whispered stories and makeshift lullabies. I taught him how to spell resilience before he knew how to ride a bike. He used to call me his lighthouse because you never move, even when the waves get bad. That was Leo. My Leo. The boy who kissed my hand when I wrapped his blisters from soccer. The one who hugged me so tight on the day he got into college, He left a wrinkle in my blouse that never quite came out. When he asked me for help paying tuition, I didn't hesitate. I sold the last thing of value I had, my wedding ring, long tucked away in the back of a drawer, still glinting with stories I never told. He never knew what it cost me. I didn't want him to. I wanted him to fly without ever seeing how hard I ran beneath him just to keep the wind going. On his 16th birthday, he didn't want a party, just a movie night at home with me. We made popcorn in a dented pot and watched a science fiction film on my laptop. And when the hero said, "Home isn't a place, it's a person," Leo turned to me and whispered, "That's you." I used to iron his shirts before exams and tuck notes into his pencil case. "You've got this." When he got his first heartbreak, he called me in the middle of the night just to cry. And when he got his first job, he showed up at my door with a paper bag full of groceries and said, "You don't have to do everything anymore." But I still did. I always did. I clipped coupons for wedding things before anyone asked. I offered before he had to. I said yes before I heard the question. Because that's what love looked like in my world, showing up even when the invitation got lost. I held the seams together with quiet hands and steady eyes, hoping he would always feel safe enough to leave, but sure enough to come back. But now, in the quiet hum of a motel room I wasn't supposed to see, I finally asked myself what I had never dared to before: if love means giving without measure, what does it mean when they forget who gave? When did I become the background? Was it when he introduced Susan as the woman who helped raise me, or when he stopped looking up from his phone when I walked into the room? Maybe it was gradual. Maybe I missed the moment. But sitting there, beside a wall with peeling paint and a lamp that flickered every time I breathed too hard, I couldn't deny it anymore. I wasn't his lighthouse now. I wasn't his home. I was a logistical footnote in someone else's itinerary, and the worst part was, I had built the road they walked on to leave me behind. He didn't turn his back on me. He just kept walking forward like I wasn't meant to follow. The signs didn't arrive like thunder. They came soft, like fog slipping in under the door while you're still asleep, subtle enough to ignore if you wanted to believe things were fine. It started with the phone calls. Less frequent, shorter, functional. "Hey, Mom. Can't talk long. Work's crazy. Yeah, we'll figure out the wedding stuff later. No, nothing's wrong. Just tired. The kind of tired that doesn't go away. The kind that builds a wall between two people who used to finish each other's sentences." When Leo told me he was getting married, I smiled before I even knew her name. He showed me a photo, Emily. Bright eyes, perfect teeth, hair styled in soft waves like she'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine. "She's amazing. Mom, you'll love her." I told him I already did because I loved whoever he loved. That's what mothers do. I offered help. He said it was fine. I sent over wedding magazine clippings and budget spreadsheets. He never replied. Eventually, I just stopped sending them. He said they wanted something streamlined, elevated, less traditional. I didn't ask what that meant, though I had a sinking feeling I already knew. I asked about my role in the ceremony. Would there be a mother-son dance, a speech, a reading? He brushed it off. "We're keeping it simple." I asked where I'd be staying. He said, "Don't worry, it's all taken care of." When I mentioned Susan, he hesitated. "She's helping a lot with the planning." I nodded. I didn't ask more. But the second time I called and Susan answered his phone, laughing, "Oh hey, he's just stepping out. I'll let him know you called." Something shifted in my stomach. It wasn't jealousy. It was erasure. Soft, deliberate, practiced. A new cast of characters stepping into my son's life, rewriting the script, crossing out old lines in pencil that never quite faded, but now blurred. The rehearsal dinner came. I wore the pale lavender dress I had chosen 6 months earlier, the one Leo said brought out my eyes. He didn't notice. I sat 2 seats away from him, flanked by strangers. He never introduced me. The host thanked everyone who helped raise such a remarkable man. Susan smiled, dabbed her eyes with a napkin, and raised her glass. No one corrected it. No one turned to me. I laughed softly into my wine glass, pretending I hadn't heard it. I watched as Susan walked around the room, hugging cousins I hadn't seen in years, calling them by names she only knew because I once said them out loud. She took up space like it had always been hers. I shrank into mine like I was borrowing it. That night, I asked Leo quietly, "Do you remember the promise you made when you got your first paycheck?" He blinked. "You said, 'I'll never forget who helped me get here.'" He looked down. "Mom, don't make this about guilt. I wanted to say I wasn't. I was making it about memory." But I nodded. Let it go, like I always did. The morning after, I sent him a text. "Can't wait to see where I'll be staying. Let me know." He replied, "It's all set. Don't stress. No address, no detail, just assumption." Like my presence was a postscript, like a mother is just luggage someone else handles. I stared at my phone and felt something quiet pull loose in my chest. Not a snap. Not yet. Just the beginning of a tear you don't notice until the whole seam gives way. 2 days later, I called to confirm the room with the venue directly. I gave my name. The woman paused. "Could you repeat that?" she asked, then shuffled papers. "Oh, it looks like that room's been reassigned." My throat went dry. "To whom?" Another pause. "Susan Langley." That was the moment. That was the slice. She had my name. She had my room. And somehow, I knew by the way the woman on the phone softened her tone, by the way she offered me a smaller guest room at a nearby motel, I knew this wasn't a mistake. I knew it had been decided long before I arrived. I hung up, sat still for 5 minutes, and then stood slowly like the room might vanish under my feet. That afternoon, Leo sent a text, "So excited to see you this weekend. It's going to be perfect." And I stared at it for a long time. No mention of the room, no mention of the change, no mention of Susan. Just that word perfect, like he was painting a picture where I was already edited out, hoping I wouldn't notice the missing parts. They didn't remove me. They just rehearsed the new cast until I became a silence they didn't have to explain. The day of the wedding, I arrived early. I told myself it was to avoid traffic, but the truth was, I needed time. Time to breathe. Time to adjust. Time to prepare myself for whatever small role I still had. I wore the dress I'd saved for months to buy. Soft blue with delicate embroidery at the cuffs, the same shade Leo once said reminded him of the sky right after a storm. My hair was set, nails done in a pale pink I hadn't worn in years, and I had even packed a spare pair of flats in case the heels gave me trouble. I stepped into the lobby of the venue carrying the weight of every silent yes I'd ever given that boy, thinking perhaps I was overthinking it all. But the moment I reached the front desk and gave my name, the receptionist looked at me like she was bracing for something. "Oh," she said, tapping nervously on her keyboard. "It looks like your room was reassigned. We've arranged to stay at the Garden Way Inn just a few miles from here. Same check-in, same amenities. My room, the one Leo had promised, was just upstairs, walking distance to everything. The one he said had a view of the lake and was perfect for pictures. That room now had someone else's name on it. I didn't ask who. I already knew. Susan, stepmother of the groom. The title landed like a slap wrapped in lace. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I took the key card for the off-site motel and walked back to my car. the summer heat wrapping itself around me like something I couldn't shake off. The Garden Way Inn sat behind a gas station, its sign missing 2 letters, buzzing faintly in the sunlight. My room had a single bed, a flickering lamp, and curtains that smelled faintly of cigarettes. There was no lake view, no flowers, no place to hang my dress. I used a plastic hanger and the hook behind the door. The mirror was cracked in one corner. I applied my lipstick in the reflection, tilting my head to avoid the splinter. I buttoned my shoes slowly, listening to the air conditioning sputter like it was gasping. There were no texts from Leo, no updates, no apology. I looked at the time. The ceremony was in an hour. I grabbed my purse, stood for a moment in the center of that dim little room, and took a breath so deep I felt it scrape the bottom of my ribs. When I arrived at the venue, the ushers smiled brightly, handing out programs with gold lettering. Mother of the groom, I read, scanning the pages. The name under that heading was blank. No mention, no role, no reading, no speech. Just Susan's name in several places, including the welcome note. She has been such a joy to our family, it said, in cursive. I stood at the back, watching guests take their seats. I waited. No one looked for me. No one noticed. At some point, a young woman in black approached me and whispered, "The bride would like family seated closer to the front." I nodded. "Of course." Then she pointed. "You'll be over here, near the side exit." A folding chair, next to the water station, not even a full view of the altar. I sat. The music began. I turned my head just enough to see Susan taking Leo's arm and walking him down the aisle. Guests smiled. Cameras flashed. Someone said, "How beautiful." And I sat there in the shade, blinking slowly, a cold knot forming in the center of my chest. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I just watched the woman who took my room, my title, and now, my moment, walk with my son like she'd earned it. And maybe to them, she had. Maybe proximity and polish had outweighed the years of laundry, late nights, and sacrifice. Maybe in their version of the story, I was just the footnote necessary, but forgettable. My hands folded in my lap, the program creased between my fingers. I pressed my lips together so tightly they trembled. I told myself to breathe, to hold it in, to be graceful, because that's what invisible mothers do at weddings they help pay for. They smile, they shrink, they stay seated. And when the bride walks past with a bouquet in hand and no acknowledgement in her eyes, they look down at their shoes and pretend not to notice. I wasn't pushed out. I was seated gently where no one had to look at me twice. The reception was louder than the ceremony. All clinking glasses and curated playlists and laughter that rose like champagne bubbles, but I heard none of it the way it was intended. I heard it like echoes behind glass, distant and sharp at the edges. My chair was tucked near the side wall, just past the buffet where steam curled off silver trays and servers moved too fast to notice me. I wasn't on the seating chart. No name card. No plate with a folded napkin waiting. Just an empty chair someone motioned toward with vague politeness, like I was a guest who had arrived uninvited but couldn't be turned away. I sat down slowly, smoothing my dress, my hands trembling just enough that I had to clench them into fists under the tablecloth. The band was setting up in the corner. Someone announced the first dance. The lights dimmed, and for a moment, I could almost forget where I was. But then Leo stepped into the center of the room with Emily in his arms, and the applause swallowed everything else. They moved together like a photograph in motion, her head resting gently on his shoulder, and I waited for a glance, a nod, a flicker of memory, It never came. His eyes never met mine. Not once. I watched my son, the boy who once begged me not to let go in the middle of a thunderstorm, dance under chandeliers I helped pay for, holding a woman who barely knew the shape of his scars, and I realized something so painful it made me dizzy. I had been invited for the checkbook, not the memory, for the funding, not the presence, for the appearance, not the truth. The food came, a plate of cold chicken breast, overcooked green beans, and a dinner roll that crumbled at the touch. No one asked if I had dietary needs. No one noticed I hadn't eaten since morning. I held my fork like it might steady me, then set it down without taking a bite. Across the room, Susan was laughing with guests, her pearls catching the light. Someone clinked a glass and shouted for a toast. Leo stood, adjusting his cufflinks, and began to speak. "We are so grateful to be surrounded by love today," he said, his voice strong, practiced. "To everyone who made this day possible, you've given us a gift we'll never forget." He didn't say my name, not once. He didn't mention the bills I paid, the planning I offered, the late nights I spent sewing a hem on his old suit so he could wear it to prom. He didn't mention the mother who raised him, just the family who welcomed him. The word welcome stung more than any slap. I sat through the toasts, through the laughter, through the clicking of heels and the sparkle of dresses and the clatter of forks on china. I smiled when someone walked past me and nodded vaguely, not remembering who I was. And when the music swelled again and the dance floor filled, I stood slowly, walked back to the buffet, and poured myself a glass of water. No one stopped me. No one followed. I walked down the hallway and found a bathroom, locked the door, leaned against the sink, and stared at myself in the mirror under the yellowed light. My lipstick had faded. There was a crease in the corner of my eye I hadn't noticed before. I looked older than I felt and smaller than I remembered. I ran the tap, cupped water into my palms, pressed it to my face. It didn't wash away anything. I stayed in that bathroom long enough for the song to end. When I stepped out again, no one had noticed I was gone. No one had asked. I returned to my corner, to my quiet, to my untouched plate. A server passed by, offered cake. I took it, raspberry and vanilla. Emily's favorite. I don't even like raspberry. I ate it anyway. I swallowed the taste of being forgotten. I looked around the room, watched guests laughing with their mouths full, people posing for photos in front of a neon sign that read, "The Langley's Forever." I wasn't in a single frame. Susan posed beside Leo like she had waited her whole life for this caption. "Mother of the groom," someone said. She smiled like it fit. I closed my eyes for a second, just enough to press back the sting. I remembered all the nights Leo fell asleep on my chest, all the scraped knees, all the parent-teacher meetings I showed up to alone. I remembered his fever when he was 5, how I stayed up singing to him in the kitchen with a wet towel on his forehead, how I whispered promises into his ear even when I wasn't sure I could keep them. I remembered the first time he said "I love you" without being asked. I remembered who I had been to him and who I no longer was. And then I opened my eyes, picked up the fork, and took one last bite of cake I didn't like, in a room where no one knew I hated raspberry. I wasn't pushed aside. I was placed where no one had to remember what I'd given. I didn't leave right away. I sat there until the candles burned low and the last song faded, until guests began pulling on coats and unpinning hair, until the band started packing up cables and someone began stacking chairs with the kind of efficiency that signals it's time to disappear. No one said goodnight to me. No one asked if I had a ride. I walked out alone, heels in hand, crossing the gravel path under string lights that blinked like they too were ready to shut down. My feet ached, the skin along my heel torn where the strap had rubbed raw. In the parking lot, I passed Susan laughing with a group of guests. She didn't see me or pretended not to. I slipped into the back of a cab and gave the driver the name of the motel without flinching. He didn't say a word, just nodded and turned up the radio. I leaned my head against the window, watched the trees blur past, tried not to cry, but there was nothing left in me to release. Not sadness, not rage, not even confusion, just a hollowed-out quiet, like someone had scooped the center of me out and left the shell still standing. When I reached the room, I didn't bother changing. I sat on the edge of the bed, dress wrinkled, makeup smeared, hands resting limp in my lap. The lamp buzzed softly. I stared at the floral pattern on the comforter and wondered how long it had been since I'd felt at home anywhere. I opened my phone. There were no missed calls, no messages. I scrolled through the photos. I hadn't been part of the memories I hadn't been invited to create. I zoomed in on Leo's face. He looked happy. Genuinely. That was the cruelest part. My absence hadn't dimmed a thing. It hadn't registered. It hadn't mattered. I set the phone down and opened the drawer of the nightstand, looking for nothing in particular, maybe a tissue, maybe something to occupy my hands. What I found was my own hand, brushing against the corner of a folded paper I had tucked into my purse earlier and forgotten. I pulled it out slowly, smoothing it across my lap. It was a drawing, faded with time, a child's scrawl of crooked lines in bright crayon, a treasure map. X marks the spot. To Mama, the best adventure. Leo had made it when he was 7. He had hidden it under my pillow one night and told me there was treasure in the closet if I followed the clues. I found a plastic ring and a chocolate bar. I still remembered the way he grinned when I told him it was the greatest treasure I'd ever found. Holding that paper now, my hands trembled. Not from pain, but from recognition. That I had once been someone so beloved, so central, that a child believed the world revolved around my smile. That I had once been the prize at the end of a map. I traced the lines with my finger, the ink now ghosting across the page. And in that moment, something inside me stirred not anger, not even sorrow, but memory. Not of who I had lost, but who I had been, who I still was, somewhere under the layers of erasure. I folded the map again, gently, carefully, as if it were still sacred, and placed it back into my purse not as a keepsake, but as a reminder. I stood, looked at myself in the mirror above the dresser, saw the woman who stayed silent through 100 slights, who showed up even when uninvited, who gave without keeping score. I brushed a curl behind my ear and whispered, "You are still the treasure. They didn't take away my place. They just forgot I ever had one. But I remember. I didn't pack that morning out of anger. I packed because my hands needed something to do, something to fold and zip and carry, something that belonged only to me. I slid my dress back into its garment bag, the one I had pressed with lavender spray and tissue paper a week before the wedding, thinking I'd be sharing a suite upstairs, not hanging it on a hook beside a motel mini fridge. I folded my shoes into a grocery bag, wrapped my jewelry in a napkin from the night before, wiped the mascara residue from the corner of my eye, and sat on the bed one last time. The room smelled faintly of old carpet and something lemon-scented that never quite reached clean. I looked around at the broken blind, the chipped mirror, the stain near the corner where the wall met the floor, and thought, this is where they thought I belonged. Not out of malice, but convenience. I opened my purse and pulled out the envelope I had carried with me the entire weekend. Inside were receipts, not metaphors, real ones. Printed, dated, stapled. Deposit on the venue. Balance for the florist. Custom invitations from a calligrapher in Vermont. The upgraded catering menu because Emily wanted lamb instead of chicken. The rehearsal dinner Leo said they had covered, but I paid when the invoice arrived with no one else's name on it. Thousands of dollars. Quietly transferred. Quietly accepted. Never once acknowledged. I opened my tablet and brought up the wedding budget spreadsheet I had kept meticulously for 18 months, every cell color-coded, every vendor contact updated, every suggestion from Emily turned into a line item I handled. My initials were next to all of them. I scrolled through it slowly, not to prove a point, but to remind myself it wasn't a dream. It was a transaction I had funded and been erased from. I sat at the small desk in the motel room and began printing. The front desk clerk let me use their printer. She didn't ask why. I returned with a stack of paper in a manila folder. In the top corner of the first page, I wrote, in plain black ink for Leo. I didn't write a note. I didn't add emotion. Just the facts. Let the numbers speak the love that was never mentioned. I placed the receipts in order florals, food, decor, music, even the late-night dessert bar Emily had asked for just for ambiance. I included the bar tab they put on my card the night before the rehearsal dinner, the one I found by accident while reconciling my bank statement. I didn't cross anything out. I didn't highlight. I didn't need to. It was all there in black and white. I put the folder in my purse and drove to the venue again, not during the party, but after. The parking lot was half empty, the balloons slightly deflated, the string lights still flickering as if unsure whether to celebrate or surrender. The woman at the front desk blinked when she saw me. I smiled gently, handed her the folder, and said, "Please make sure this reaches the groom." She nodded. I didn't wait for questions. I didn't need to explain. I turned and walked back to my car, the air clearer than it had been all weekend, the sky overcast but still soft. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't spectacle. It was record. It was evidence. Not of money, but of presence. Of all the invisible things a mother does that no one writes down unless she's the one doing the writing. On the way back to the motel, I stopped at a corner store and bought a bottle of water and a small notebook. When I got back to the room, I sat by the window, opened to the first page, and wrote the date. I didn't write about the wedding. I wrote about the scent of lemon cleaner. I wrote about the silence of being forgotten. I wrote about the ache in my spine from sitting too long on a chair that wobbled. And then I wrote the sentence that had been circling my mind since the ceremony I was not missing. I was dismissed. I underlined it, twice. I closed the notebook, placed it beside my purse, and lay down fully clothed, the air conditioner humming like a tired breath. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just let the quiet hold me like it had been waiting to carry the pieces I'd gathered. I didn't ask for credit. I just refused to be erased. The letter wasn't something I went looking for. It found me the way old grief does quietly, in the corners you stop checking, in drawers you only open when you're searching for something else entirely. I was standing in the guest room, trying to make space, holding a stack of wedding receipts and half-crushed floral ribbons I didn't know why I'd brought home, when I knocked over a box I hadn't touched in years. It was the box I had kept Leo's baby things in, the ones I hadn't thrown out because I thought maybe, one day, he'd want them for his own children. The ones I used to open on nights when I needed to remember that all the sacrifices meant something. Inside were the usual bits: the blue knitted cap from the hospital, his kindergarten drawing of a house with 2 stick figures, one tall, one small, with the label Mom plus Me, and at the very bottom, Beneath a yellowed immunization card and a crumpled birthday invitation from a classmate I'd forgotten, there was an envelope. No stamp, no return address. Just my name. Helen, written in slanted, anxious handwriting I hadn't seen since my divorce. My breath caught. I sat down on the floor, the box beside me, the envelope trembling in my hands. I didn't open it at first. I just held it, felt its weight, and tried to remember if there had been any goodbye, any last phone call, any hint that Michael had ever wanted to make peace before he died. There hadn't. He had left like he lived unfinished. But the envelope was real, and my name was on it. And when I finally slid my finger under the flap, something sharp inside me braced for impact. The paper was thin, folded in half, and the writing was uneven. Helen, it began, and then, I know I don't deserve your time, but if this finds you, please let me tell you what I never could in person. I read the next line 3 times before I could breathe. Leo isn't your biological son. I stared at the words, willing them to make sense, waiting for them to soften or rearrange or offer a footnote. But they just sat there flat, blunt, irreversible. The rest came like slow poison. Michael had met Emily, a girl barely 18, pregnant, terrified, unwilling to keep the child. She had turned to him in desperation, and instead of arranging for adoption, he'd panicked. He had brought Leo home and told me the baby was his from a fling before we married. I remembered that conversation. I remembered crying, then forgiving, then cradling that infant against my chest like the ache in my heart didn't matter because I had a son now. I had believed him, and from that moment, I became a mother. Not legally, not biologically, but in the ways that matter when the baby won't sleep and the fevers don't break and the shoes don't fit and the bullies at school say he's too quiet. I became his history, his home, his every first, and all of it had been built on a lie. I folded the letter, then unfolded it, then folded it again. I wanted to scream. I wanted to find Michael and ask him why. Why steal my right to choose, my right to know, my right to be more than the unsuspecting heart who raised someone else's child without question. But there was no one left to blame, no one to answer, just silence. And a memory of a boy who once whispered, I don't need anyone else. Mom, you're everything. I sat in that room for what felt like hours, holding that truth in my lap like a second child, unexpected, complicated, but real. I picked up the drawing Leo made when he was 7, the treasure map with the red X marked Mom's heart, and laid it beside the letter. 2 truths, 2 versions of motherhood, one built in secret, one built in sacrifice. And somehow, the second still stood. Because love the real kind doesn't need a DNA match to be permanent. It just needs to be chosen every single day. And I had chosen him without knowing, without asking, without needing to be told. I had chosen him in the way I showed up, again and again, even when the world forgot I was there. I wasn't made his mother. I became her. One sleepless night at a time, and no lie could undo that. I didn't need to confront him. I didn't need to hold the letter up like a weapon or storm into his life with all the truth he had never bothered to ask for. That kind of scene belonged to other people, to women who wanted to be heard by the ones who had silenced them. I had no desire to explain myself to someone who hadn't even noticed I was missing. Healing. I'd learned wasn't loud. It didn't need witnesses or vindication or applause. Sometimes it was just a woman folding the last photo of her son into a box and choosing not to tape it shut just yet. That morning I made the smallest, quietest choice that somehow felt like an earthquake inside my chest. I chose not to reach out. I didn't send the letter. I didn't forward the receipts. I didn't write a post. I didn't call to say, "You forgot me." Instead, I changed the bed sheets. I cleared the table. I boiled water for tea and watched it steam up against the kitchen window like a reminder that something could rise again even after being cold for so long. I opened the windows and let in the scent of spring wet grass, cracked soil, something alive trying to come back. I hadn't noticed how still the house had become, how carefully I had been tiptoeing around my own memories like they might bite. But now, I moved through it all like I owned every inch of this silence. Because I did. And in that silence, I began to make something new. I sat down with an old notebook, the kind with wide margins and a frayed corner, and I wrote a list not of tasks or errands or things I had to fix, but of people who had once made me feel like I existed. Claire from the ER who brought me soup after my gallbladder surgery even though she hated cooking. My neighbor Mr. Henderson, who always put out an extra garbage bin for me when Leo went away to college. Diane, my cousin, who sent me a card every birthday even when I forgot hers. These weren't grand gestures. They were tiny doorways into connection moments where someone had said with their presence, "I see you." I texted them all the same invitation dinner at my place. No occasion, just me. And they came. They came like it was the most natural thing in the world. Diane brought flowers from her garden, messy and mismatched and perfect. Mr. Henderson brought a pie from the local diner and warned it was probably too sweet. Claire showed up with a bottle of wine and no makeup, wearing her scrubs, and hugged me like I was the person she needed to see after a long shift. I made roasted vegetables and lemon chicken, mashed potatoes with extra butter, and a green salad with vinaigrette I had whisked by hand. The table wasn't fancy, just a wooden surface scuffed by years of Leo's homework and Sunday breakfasts, but it had candles, cloth napkins, and 4 plates that didn't match but somehow belonged together. We sat down and ate and talked and passed things with open hands. Nobody asked about the wedding. Nobody mentioned Leo. And yet, I had never felt more mothered in my life. Claire told a story about a patient who sang to her mid-surgery. Diane showed me a photo of her dog in a Halloween costume. Mr. Henderson told me how he once locked himself out of his house in a bathrobe. We laughed. Real laughter. The kind that climbs out of your throat and reminds you there's still something soft in you that can respond to joy. And then, somewhere between the second serving of pie and the bottom of the wine bottle, Claire raised her glass and said, "To Helen for choosing herself. Finally." Everyone raised theirs. And I did too, hand steady, heart quiet, not because I needed their permission, but because for the first time in a long time, I believed I deserved the toast. After they left, I didn't cry. I didn't clean up right away. I let the mess sit like proof that something real had happened here. I took the box labeled memory, not obligation, and gently placed it on the top shelf of the closet. I didn't lock it away. I just gave it distance. I poured myself a glass of water, sat in the chair by the window, and looked at the night like it might finally be done swallowing me. I was alone, but I wasn't lonely. I was quiet, but I wasn't silenced. I was still, but I was not stuck. They didn't banish me. They just left the door open, thinking I wouldn't walk through it, and I did, just not the way they expected. If you are still listening, maybe it's because you've stood somewhere like I did, quiet in a room where your name wasn't called, wearing clothes you ironed with care for people who never looked up. Maybe you've stayed seated when you should have left, or left when you should have been celebrated. Maybe you've poured everything you had into someone else's moment, thinking your presence would be enough to be remembered. And when it wasn't, you told yourself it was okay, that love doesn't need a spotlight, that sacrifice doesn't need applause. But I need you to know something. From one woman to another, from one silence to another, forgetting you was never your fault. Being erased was never a reflection of your worth. If you gave everything and were met with silence, it says nothing about the love you gave and everything about the emptiness of those who couldn't hold it. I don't have a big ending to give you. I didn't get an apology or a last-minute redemption speech. I didn't walk out to music swelling behind me or doors flung open with tears and second chances. I walked out holding my own hand, sat down at my own table, and served food I made for people who saw me. And that was enough. That was more than enough. So if you're sitting in the hallway outside someone else's joy, if your seat got taken, if your name didn't make the program, don't wait to be called in. Don't stay quiet just to make them comfortable. You are not difficult. You are not invisible. You are not a footnote in their story. You are the whole damn chapter in your own. If you've ever been asked to step aside for someone who hadn't walked half your road, if you've ever felt like a stranger in the home you helped build, please remember your presence is not optional. Your love is not replaceable. Set your own table. Light your own candles. Pour your own glass. Because you were never just invited, you were the reason there was something to celebrate at all.